Hello. Thank you again. Thank you for that introduction. And I'm very honored to be here. Today's presentation is on prioritizing cybersecurity risks on a shoestring. And as you've heard, my name is William Bailey, Security, Privacy, and Risk Consultant. And of course, the things I say here today, keep in mind that this material and these views that I'm presenting today, they're my own, and they do not necessarily represent the views of any current or previous employer. As we go through, we'll talk about some items here to keep in mind. Oftentimes, we don't have unlimited budgets, and so what I've tried to do is draw on my prior experience, although I'm not going to tell you where that experience came from per se. So our goal, of course, and why we're all here, we need to protect systems, and there are a couple reasons we need to do that. It could be because of a regulation, or it could be because we entered into a contract, which, of course, we're supposed to follow like it was law, or we've just decided to. So, but we have to keep in mind that our budget is limited, and or non-existent sometimes. And we want to adopt best practices, and there are frameworks galore. And just as a drop-down list here in one of the products that I was using, literally, you can pull out the capability maturity model index, or you could pull out MITRE ATT&CK, or you could pull up the NIST 853 or 171, and it's probably a whole lot of numbers to a lot of you. There's a lot of frameworks out there. And maybe you're walking into a situation, as I have in the past, where there wasn't a strategy already set in place. That you're walking in and you're starting, and you're asking yourself, where do I start? And of course, this slide I had to put on here. We're now in a COVID-19 era. So for some of you who have seen me present before, I had to make a few changes here for COVID-19 because it does change our reality of what we have to do to achieve this goal, because you've got that pressure to get the systems out there, but at the same time, you need to protect the information belonging to the organization. And one of the examples that people will sometimes refer to is the CIS controls. It's gone through a few different names. And they first broke it out into tiers, that there were basic controls, and then there were foundational controls, and then there were organizational controls. And there were certain controls that you had to get right off the bat. Now, in the latest version of the CIS controls, version 7.1, they also added a concept of implementation groups. And I'll talk about how that fits in. It's almost like an overlay over top of the controls, if you think about it. And what that does is allows the organization to recognize their size and their complexity and their innate ability. Because some of you might be working for a financial institution that is sitting around, say, 145 million asset size, whereas others of you are logging on from a financial service institution that is exponentially larger, billions and billions. And so what you can do changes, and rather than taking what you might get recommended for billion dollar size organization, if you have a smaller asset size, you want to scale appropriately, and you want to get the most you can. But what we found, or rather not we found, but this is the Verizon data breach incident report. And literally what they found is that if you addressed just the top 5 controls within the CIS top 20, you literally would stop 85% of the breaches. They analyzed those breaches, and 85% of them, it would either eliminate the breach completely or greatly reduce it to the point where it would not be a significant breach anymore. It's really a startling fact that sometimes some of the basic hygiene elements are what help you have a good security program. And a moment ago, I said that in the CIS, they recognized with their top controls, they realized, well, let's scale this based upon the size of the organization. And so the very first control is one of the most important ones, and that's the inventory of control of your hardware assets. Basically, if you think about it, you have to know what you have in order to protect it, right? And I chose this one because the second control deals with software. So again, you have to know what you have to do something about it. And so you actually, with the implementation groups, you could actually put it into tiers. And so one of the first things, it's very basic hygiene, is that you have to maintain a detailed asset inventory. You have to know what you have, and you have to have some means of addressing unauthorized assets. Now, there are organizations of all different sizes, and how do you achieve this? And I'll talk about, as we go through this, you don't have to buy the best tool out there. You just have to find one that works for you to start addressing this issue. Knowing what you have is the number one thing. You have to know what assets you have on hand, and you also want to be able to detect the unauthorized assets. Now, as you step up in maturity of your organization, you might go from manual types of checks to automated types of checking, and that's where you see in Group 2, implementation Group 2 is recommended by CIS that you use an active discovery tool that automatically probes your network for you. Talk a little bit more to get some of these additional automated tools, but you enable DHCP plugging to update your asset inventory as your devices are moving. And you maintain your asset inventory information, and you deploy port-level access controls. Now, once you get to a larger size organization, you might actually start using a passive asset discovery tool. See, Active Directory and DHCP, you probably have those in-house already. Once you get to a larger size organization, you might want to look for something that's not just using those Active Directory or DHCP logs. And you can actually verify your certificates on your clients, a client certificate to authenticate the hardware assets. They say, well, why doesn't everybody do this? Well, the answer is simple. We don't have the resources. We don't have people, we don't have time, and we don't have money. And it kind of all boils down to money if you think about it, right? We can't do everything. But the thing is, rather than put our heads in the sand, the most important thing to think about is when you're trying to secure your assets, pay attention to what you have and try to do something. Because that's one of the biggest things I found in years that I was working with covered entities in the healthcare space. And if there was some sort of an incident, one of the biggest things that came through in any of those reports was the fact that if the organization did nothing, then they would be held out as an example. It's the basic things. Like if you look at implementation group 1 and some of these basic things, it's almost like saying, I'm going to leave the key to my car in my car when I go inside of the convenience store. I'm basically asking somebody to take the information. And so by using some of the implementation groups, it's a way of managing what you invest in. Now, in the rest of this presentation, I'm going to go through some examples of what I mean, and we'll talk about some tools at a high level. It's not tool-specific per se, but just to give you some tactics that work. And these are things that Nancy has given you the introduction to a little bit about me. I've been in the industry for years, and I've seen all sorts of different sizes. And these are just general things that everyone can put into practice. And sometimes we just need to remind ourselves. And, it really is a series of building blocks. And anytime anyone says, well, what do I need to do to protect my information? And the first thing, believe it or not, is you need to have policies. And I'll talk in greater detail about what those policies look like, and they're going to change over time. So you're not going to reinvent the wheel. You're not going to build the perfect scenario on day one, but you start with policies, and you mature as you go. But then there are certain easy wins, and such as knowing what you have. Believe it or not, on that slide back there, when we talked about 85% of those breaches, if you remember, we talked about the inventory of your hardware and your software being the top two items on that table. That's know what you have. What computers do you have? What software do you have? And that's really the building block to the other elements. Now, don't use defaults. And we'll talk about those in a little bit greater detail. The default values and some of the breaches that are out there. And I won't name the names because you could research those names. Literally, if you look at the reports, you see that sometimes those breaches were the direct result of a user default, a default value that's published in the instruction manuals for your product. So that's an easy win. And some of these, they don't even cost you anything, just to change the default value. Creating standards. And this is you create your standard. Now, we'll take a couple steps beyond that. We'll say, well, does that protection have to be 100%? And it's a building block. And sometimes, if you remember a second ago, we talked about the implementation groups. Notice I didn't tell you, I never would tell you that you have to do all 3 implementation groups. That's exactly the beauty of implementation groups. And if that's not the framework you use, try to see which one of those controls would offer you the best bang for your buck and those that are doable. And that's one of the key things. You have to be able to do whatever you say you're going to do. And document your procedures and follow them. Now, there's also some techniques that involve social networking. And part of your building block is to just realize that in information security and privacy and risk, we're always going to have to continue learning. And that's why I actually picked that graphic. Lather, rinse, repeat. Really, it's an iterative type of process that you just learn what you're doing and you see what you're doing, and that helps refine your policy that feeds back into this whole system. Rome was not built in a day. The policies, though, are really your foundation. And, one of the first points I'll say is that this is going forward. Just because you've done something that way for the last 20 years doesn't mean that that's the way it should be done now. Think about where you are today and where are you going. Make sure that you match your capability. I've seen people say that we're going to monitor internet traffic 24/7 and we'll have HR violations. Well, wait. If you don't really have that capability to monitor the traffic, or if you don't do it consistently, if you don't have the capability to do it, then you need to be careful how you call that out in your policies. Don't make yourself overworked because, with my healthcare experience, I would see organizations, covered entities, try to claim that they would do all of these things, but they didn't do it. And unfortunately, in the HIPAA rules, if you say you're going to do something and you don't do it, that just means that you're at fault. So the policies should also be measurable. There should be some sort of a metric that people can do. And that's where, I think of like the speed limit sign. It's a real clear cut, 55. I know no one does 55. It's 65, it's 80, it's whatever it is. But it is measurable. And that way you know the difference between you're going too fast or you're not going too fast. You know generally what's appropriate. Now, policies, I like to think that these are incremental changes and they're reviewed annually. And there's a couple things there. They can be incremental because you can't do everything from day one. You don't have all the technology. If you're on a shoestring, you don't have an unlimited budget, if any. So what do? Well, what can I do with what I have now? And that's one of the things that really folks need to remember is that whatever you say you're going to enforce, you need to have a way of tracking it. Now, you might have exceptions to policy, and that's okay. I'm putting up my hands for a second and going, pause. Those exceptions are reviewed periodically, right? It's not a lifetime exemption. And this draws from, even if you look at the NIST documentation and the strict interpretation of those exceptions, and organizations will get authorizations to operate with exclusions and things of that sort. But those exceptions get reviewed periodically. Now, policies, and I've seen different types of policies over the years. I tend to recommend that a policy contains just enough specifics. It's a high-level document. And I'm going to save the standards, the baselines, the procedures, and the guidelines. I'm going to save the details for those other document types. And some people say, well, why? Well, because I want to be able to change this over time. And that's one of the problems with policies. If you have a policy, you have to go put it in front of a board to get it changed. And you might only be able to do that once a year. So let's make use of the different types of documents that are available to us. So now I always have to know what I have. And I did make one modification here on this slide. I actually purposely added the point that we should go, where should it be? And that's a new change on the COVID-19 era. We're used to knowing our hardware or our software. What are our hardware vendors at the desktop level, at the servers, in the networking? What's all that hardware? And what software do we have? We should know what it is, because whether we like it or not, if somebody installs software on our system, that software is now interacting with our information. And so we should be aware of any vulnerabilities that that new software or that new hardware has introduced to us. And we should know our information. That's an asset to the organization. In fact, it's really the largest asset that anybody has is their information. Now, if you're in financial services, obviously it's your financial service customers, or it's any of the financial marketplace. Our vendors are a key part of what we do, and we should know about them as well. And we should have it documented, who they are. Now, there are some tools that you can use, and I wanted to give you some examples, and this is not a specific product recommendation per se, but I did want to focus on some things that oftentimes I do get the question. In my experience working with healthcare and covered entities and in financial services and other industries, they say, well, what do I do for tools if I don't have anything and I have no budget and I'm just starting this up, and this is a proof of concept. So some examples that I offered here, the good old-fashioned Nmap. And people say, well, Nmap, I don't use Nmap. Well, actually you do, right? If you look under the covers of your Metasploit, or even if you're lucky enough to get Metasploit Pro or something like that, guess what? It's running Nmap under the covers, right? And there's Nmap, but I always love that one. If you look at Nmap, it actually shows you the command line. Like, okay, it's a basic tool that comes with our operating systems. For intrusion detection, there's an example. It was called Bro. Now it's called Zeek. But, it's very low cost type of product that I can use to look at activity on my network. When it comes to asset inventory and software inventory, I know it's not always fun. That's why I actually say spreadsheets. We don't like spreadsheets, but, well, it's something. And oftentimes, I found that I would be doing consulting, and I'm working with an organization that can't afford this high-end automated suite to perform their inventory. And that's why I put right after it funnel scripts. Because sometimes I'm going to sit there and I'm going to run scripts. It could even just be a plain old batch file that goes out and does certain automated functions. So are these IP addresses worth tracking down? You could just literally take those IP addresses, put them in a spreadsheet, take the spreadsheet, you could create a script file out of it, and it'll go and it'll run and check all those IP addresses for the next half hour or whatever it is, while you're going and getting your cup of coffee or dealing with the other fires that you have to deal with. A couple other tools that I put down here, and they're not technical, and they actually don't cost a lot of money necessarily. And that is learn the business. Understand what's important to the business. And the reason why, if I understand the business better, I can understand the nuance of what that department's dealing with. So when I was with healthcare, we wanted to know what kind of information. PHI, what kind of PHI? What level of PHI? The same thing in financial services applies. Understanding the business and what they're dealing with, because putting a control in place stops the flow of the data, stops the flow of the information. It stops the business. And really, that's what technology is here for, is to support the business. So we have to understand what that business is doing and what that business needs. An example, though, one time after learning the business, we realized it was just easy to include, say, social security number, name, date of birth, with property tax receipts. Well, no, there's a parcel for that property. We just have to say, this parcel, we paid this amount. And we cut it down to the fact that for the business need, they didn't need to share all of this extra information. And maybe they had been doing it all along, but it wasn't very secure. It wasn't protecting the privacy of that information. And if you're trying to find out some of these assets, your hardware, your software, your invitation, and your vendors, a lot of people they're very tight-lipped. And sometimes I'll joke about acquisition by MasterCard, and I don't want to recommend MasterCard over Visa or American Express or Discover, but you get my joke, is that really a lot of people are buying things on a credit card. And so talk with accounting, because those records get reviewed. How do I find those vendors? Because people don't want to tell me. Well, let's talk with accounting. They're keeping track of those numbers. Anyone who's keeping track of your contracts, that you should have someone who's doing that, and that's a good way to build up that list of your vendors. And you're just building this over time as you go through, but you have to know what you have. Now, the COVID-19 part of this, I said, where should it be? And that's a double-edged sword, because it's where is it and where should it be? Because yes, we're sending things home to people. We're sending machines home to people. Should it be there? And we do need to think about what risks exist if that asset is moved. Because it's one thing if it's locked up inside your bank or your credit union, and you've got it well guarded, versus it's sitting in someone's house. And if it's in someone's house, the security controls are nowhere near the same. Let's face it, if they have a child, the child's going to want to pick up that laptop and start to use it. And who knows what they're going to do with it. So when we think about our assets, then we can start thinking about our cybersecurity or a cybersecurity program triangle. And I've heard some folks call everything all the same. And one of the concepts I found is that we really need to think of these as a series of documents that are living and breathing and change over time. And some of you on these sessions, maybe you've experienced it firsthand already. It's not fun, is it? That you're sitting there with a policy document, and you really need to get that policy document right, because the policy group or board only meets once a year. Well, wait a minute. How do I change my policy if I can only change it once a year? So policies are high-level do's and don'ts. And as someone who used to be a little creative with my use of technology at times, the high-level do's or don'ts are actually better, because if you put too much specific information in a policy, you'll get someone who will say something like, wait a minute, you said I couldn't use Yahoo, but I could use Google Plus. Technically, it's not in the policy. So, yeah, the policies, they should be high-level do's and don'ts. Now, we'll have statements such as, you must use XYZ encryption as a standard. Now, by having it actually as a standard, it allows me to change that out as that standard changes without having to go in front of my board. Now, in the lapse of or the absence of those, I'm going to shift to least privilege as a guideline, and I'm going to have procedures for a lot of folks that basically it's a strict recipe that anybody can follow. And on other times, like for operating systems, you'll use baseline, which might be for Windows release 1903. And obviously, if you're going to deploy something later than that, it has to exceed that. Now, of course, when you're talking about some of these standards, I have to make mention of the fact that please don't use default values. Read the fine manual. Look for those built-in accounts. Look for those passwords. Look for those ports. Look for the logging options. See what makes sense to change. Right? We've seen breaches where literally someone was able to read the vendor documentation and gain access to systems. And create your own standards. And why? Well, instead of letting everybody customize their machine in every single flavor or every single color, if you have a standard, it lets you troubleshoot easier. It actually leads to a consistency of the experience across the board. It's easier to secure, and I don't have to play a game of whack-a-mole because I don't have to support everything. So we can create old images, and there are platforms that are inexpensive that let us do that. But if we're going to buy hardware, we'll standardize our hardware. We'll standardize our software. And we'll actually introduce a process if we want to introduce new technologies rather than acquisition of credit card. So, and when we think about protection, we have to think about how much is enough. And I purposely picked that graphic there of the Chevy versus the Cadillac. And under the hood, they both have very similar engines. So in technology, your anti-malware, does it have to be the best? Or is it Windows Defender or whatever they're calling it these days, which is free with your licensing agreement? Obviously, your backup should be encrypted. And, anytime you have data in motion, you should encrypt it. But can you limit your sessions? That might be a low-cost way of fixing something. Now, passwords, the COVID-19 update, we're now remote. And anytime you're remote, you should have some sort of multi-factor authentication. And it used to be that you had to buy RSA tokens, and it was a very expensive cost. But now we're seeing a lot of low-cost solutions. And that really is one of the key themes is, you don't always need best of breed. Sometimes you just need what you need, right? And when it comes to auditing or checking of the controls, there's a term that's called sampling. And that's just basically the notion of, do I have to check all 10, or will 3 do? Now, of course, I'm probably going to say 30 and 30 versus the 1,000, and I'm going to look to see if those 30 are significantly the same. And if they are, I'm probably going to move on. I'm going and I'm going to rotate that sample. So over time, I get a good picture. And please, if you're not installing operating system updates and application updates, please install them. Don't be one of those people who are on the brief report because you didn't install an update. And remember, you don't have what you don't need. A lot of the software product just installs extra features. It might be easy to allow somebody to be the administrator of the machine. But the thing is, if they can administer the machine, they can install software, they can install malware. If you have software on the machines, remove the bloatware or extra components that don't need to be there. Like Windows NT years ago, you used to have a web server. You didn't even know it. It was already there. Remove those components, take your data, and move it to locations where you can protect it better. And follow the procedures. And make sure folks are following the procedures. Because you can't you can't document everything on the first day. So make sure you're starting to document what you're doing. And one of the best ways is for any new implementation. If you're bringing in a new vendor, you're adding a new component, you're adding software, document it. And, it could be easy. You see, Guac. Who doesn't want a side of Guac? We all do, right? Wait a minute. Do you know Guac on Red Hat Linux has connectivity to the network? So it's a VNC replacement. Maybe that should be documented. Absolutely it should. So social networking, this is how you work within your business and you learn about your business and your organization, what's unique. And some of these discussions can be informal over a cup of coffee. You can hold interviews with different folks or conduct surveys. Some of the other nice things, just simply walk through your organization. Walk through your office. But you're looking at what you see. And think to yourself, is there something here that could be compromised? Is there something here that represents a weakness? And of course, I can only learn so much through my organization, so I'm going to talk to others in industry. And that's really something you need to learn. You need to, when something happens, not just fix the problem, but perform a root cause analysis. And, look at threat intelligence from various sources. And some of these are very low cost, depending upon your organization size, like the financial services ISAC, very low cost. Look into those events that they hold. Oftentimes, if you volunteer, you get reduced admission. Actually read some of the mailing lists and skim them. I'll put vendors on here because they are a source of threat intelligence. Just make sure that you're kind of looking at it and seeing if it makes sense to you, because you can't always afford vendor training. Of course, if you get it, go ahead and use it. And also, keep an eye on what or who is in the news, because if it happened to someone else and I can learn from it, that means it doesn't happen to me. And I like that. That means I got value, and I don't have to necessarily bring someone in to learn that lesson. So in summary, I want you to remember that technology supports the business. That's why technology is here. Now, policies define the rules. They're the high-level statements. And you can't really reset to zero on everything. So keep in mind, small elements oftentimes will bring great benefits, because Rome wasn't built in a day. It took time to build it. So I wanted to give you some ways that you can apply this knowledge. And not that I'm recommending any specific vendor, the CIS, the CIsecurity.org, the top 20 controls are right there. And you can download those controls. There are lots of other services But if nothing else, you should at least read those controls, read how they map to the other framework that you might want to use in your organization. Dust off your own organization's policies to see what you should be doing, to see if things need to be updated. And I purposely left some of the red cross out here because, you know, back in February, I might have said, look around at your organization. I don't have time for that now. I'm going to quickly scan my organization. I'm going to look for the big wins. And over time, I'm going to whittle that down. Now, remember to embrace the new virtual norm. It's like we're here virtually. We're not meeting in a physical convention center anymore. So embrace the norm. Look into those events. I actually like it. I'm interacting with folks now from around the world. And when you draft your plans, we used to say draft incremental plans and change them by year. I'll be realistic here. Draft your plans, but be ready to change them, keeping in mind the cybersecurity program triangle. Basically, how do you nest those together? You want to get good policies in place, and then it just sort of drives everything else. Know your hardware and software, and theoretically, everything else should fall into place. And I usually talk those two because software is where I find my information, and it's the generator of the information. So know your hardware and software, and we saw at the very beginning that study that said, hey, you know, if I only implement the top 5 controls, 85% of my breaches. That's a Verizon data breach report, and that's held true for years. I know this is a lot of material to cover. It's you know, this is a 1,000-foot view. I thank you all, and at this point, I think we'll start to take questions from folks.